This is the Dell Optiplex GX280, and I'm having some issues with it where the graphics is basically just freezing and everything is unresponsive. I've tried replacing the graphics card and things like that with no luck, and I've noticed some capacitors which were broken and bursted, and I'm going to try to replace those. So let's start by just taking the motherboard out. So I'm going to try to do this as quick as possible. We can start by taking out all the cables, the main cable here. In order to pull out the power supply, you need to push down on the green button in the back. Push down on the green button and slide the power supply back. And it will lock out of place. And then disconnect from the board. We can move this out of the way kind of. Now to get out the motherboard itself, first take out the graphics card and anything you have connected. You can just simply pull this up, pull out the graphics card. Push down on the green button back here, slide right out. This is the replacement graphics card I got, just some cheap NVIDIA. Take out this cable first, kind of push on the tabs, pull up on the tabs on both sides. Okay, that will come out. Now unscrew the screw holding in the motherboard. Now this motherboard should slide up, so just kind of push down and slide up. Now this whole thing comes out. One more cable, and we've got our motherboard. The capacitors that are broken mainly are in between here, and then there's also one right here. So I'm going to unscrew the fan, then unplug the cable itself. This comes right out. Now these little plastic pieces just help hold it in. Just push those up against the wall and then it comes right out. And then this is what goes to the actual processor itself. If you don't have any paste to put on afterwards, you'll need to get that before you take it off. Or if you feel like you can just grab the capacitors from the outside, you could do that as well. I don't mind taking it out. This thing, there's plastic tabs holding it in. So, slide that out. This is the heatsink. The Pentium 4 is in here, and the capacitors are right here. And actually you do need to take off that because you need to get off the metal plate that is covering these capacitors so you can access them and unsolder them. So, unscrew the 4 screws. Okay, now the metal plate on the back should be free to just come off. So all of these are the capacitors, and most of those I need to replace. Then there's also a capacitor right here that I need to replace. So I'm going to have to take these out and see what the values are so that I can buy new ones. I ran into some problems where no matter how much I heated up the capacitor leads, no matter how long I was on there, it just never would actually heat up enough to melt it to where I could pull out the capacitors. Eventually, I kind of gave up. I was thinking maybe the capacitors were acting as a heat sink, drawing the heat away from the actual leads. And so then I just tore out all the capacitors, leaving the leads inside of the board. And from here, I would have to then desolder the leads, which I was thinking maybe would be easier, but I was still running into problems and I wasn't able to desolder them, and so eventually I figured this out. If I added some solder onto the actual existing solder, it would kind of combine with the old solder and it would loosen up everything. And then eventually it would be loose enough, even right now, to where I could just pull out the leads. And it made it a lot easier. Before, I wasn't able to really loosen the leads at all. But with this new method I kind of figured out, which I'm sure there's probably someone, people who know what this is, maybe there's a name for it. But maybe it's because of adding flux that's existing in the new solder, or whatever the reason, it's a lot easier to take these things out. Now here's an example with the capacitor still in. And here I'm adding solder to the leads. I'm adding both of the leads, and then I'm bridging them in between. So I'm just adding enough solder where it bridges the two leads. And then I was able to very easily pull this capacitor out, where before I wasn't even able to melt this old solder at all. And so this method allowed me to be able to pull it out. But during this method, I kind of wasn't being careful enough, and I I wore the PCB board down a little bit. As you can see, the scratches. Those actually aren't. That actually isn't metal. That's actually dug into the board, kind of a hole into the board, chipping off the board. So the only thing I'd say is make sure you're careful and fragile with whenever you're desoldering. So these are the new capacitors. As you can see, it's a 6.3 volt. It's a TO447, 105 degrees Celsius rating. It's 1800 microfarad, and I'm going to test this one real quick. This is one that was blown. It's not as bad as other ones, but I have a multimeter. I have a capacitance rating on it, and so I'm going to just check and see what it says. And even with this one, it says 837 or 786 microfarad, and that does not match up with 1800 UF. So I went to eBay to search 6.3 volt 1800 microfarad. I found this one, looked at the picture and everything and the specs, and you can see that this is a 105 degrees Celsius rating, just as the other one, and this looks pretty identical to the previous capacitor, and so I went ahead and bought 10. I'm replacing 10. So here they are in the mail, and it came in the mail. It looks just like the old ones practically, just a different brand. And here you got to make sure that you match the leads with the right direction. The line on the capacitor with the negative rating goes to the negative part, and then the positive on the capacitor goes to the white line on the PCB board. And now here I'm trying to replace them, and as you can see, I'm having some problems. I started out here with doing nothing to the leads and just trying to push it in like this. It would have been a lot easier if I had solder sucker to get out all of the solder from the board, but since I don't, you can't just put the leads all the way into the board to start out with, which would make things a lot easier. So here I was just kind of slowly moving the leads in, which was kind of a pain, especially since you're trying to hold the board and everything at the same time while soldering and pushing in the capacitor. It'd be really nice to have something to hold the board, or someone else to help you to hold the board. Here I added more solder like I did when desoldering them to help push the leads in, and it kind of helped, as you can see. And I'm just pulling the leads in, and eventually I get it. And so I'm cutting off the excess lead, and we got one capacitor in. Okay, so I'm trying, and now this is where I try to cut the leads first. It seems it would be easier to push them in like this, So just hold it in place and then heat up the leads and it pushes right in. What I realized is you've got to kind of wait a long time for the capacitor to really heat up before you could push it in, since it does act as a heat sink. You got to kind of wait for a while and then you can push it in. So here I'm trying that, but of course I run into something like that. But eventually I kind of got the hang of it, although it never really got easy. I did get the hang of it a little bit. And as I said, it would have been a lot easier if I had a solder sucker to get all of the solder out before replacing them. So all the capacitors are replaced and it's time to put this back together into the computer. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually tape the areas where I kind of melted the plastic off. Careful enough to avoid that. Just putting down some tape and then put on the metal backing plate. Turning this way, we can start by putting on the plastic holder for the CPU. Next we can add on the CPU heatsink, but right before we put it on you can add some cooler paste, which I'm not going to remove the old cooler paste, I'm just going to add on some more paste onto it. Now putting on the actual CPU heatsink. Snaps in place. Now the green plastic pieces hold this in place, help hold it in place. So just snap them back. Motherboard back into the casing. Now this is going to slide in. You've got to go back, put them in to the holes. Make sure it's all in place before you slide it in, as so. Screw in the motherboard. Now let's add the fan back on. And it can be plugged back in. Now we can plug in all the extra cables. And now we can put back in the power supply. Start by it pushed outward and then slide it in. Now we can put the graphics card back in. Everything should now be in place, and you should be able to close up the PC cover. So after fixing the PC, I plug it in and everything, and the first message that comes up, it says that the time needs to be set. And so press F2, you can get up into setup, go to the date/time tab, and you can set the date and time. And this is a pretty simple process. And then after setting the date and time, you just press the exit setup button, and then it reboots PC. And this is the first time after it's been fixed. Usually it would get stuck or freeze at the Windows loading screen here. It would just freeze up and nothing would happen after this, but as you can see, it's booting up. It's booting up into Windows 10, and every boot after this was a little bit faster than this. The first boot was a little slow, and well, that's about it. Everything after this, I've been running it for a couple weeks now, and everything works fine. Thank you all for watching. Have a great day.